We want you to know.
The latest tariff negotiations between the United States and other countries in 2025 have evolved into one of the most intricate and consequential phases of global economic diplomacy in decades, blending elements of geopolitical rivalry, domestic political strategy, and shifting trade alliances into a complex web of negotiations that are redefining how nations conduct commerce. After years of escalating trade tensions, the U.S. under President Donald Trump's renewed administration has pursued a strategy that combines aggressive tariff leverage with selective bilateral deal-making, effectively reshaping the global trade order. The central development in recent months was the October 2025 summit between President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping, where both leaders reached a fragile framework agreement aimed at de-escalating the trade confrontation that has burdened markets for years. Under the new terms, Washington agreed to reduce average tariffs on a range of Chinese imports, from roughly 57% to 47%, while Beijing pledged to temporarily lift restrictions on the export of rare earth minerals vital for the U.S. technology sector and resume large-scale purchases of American agricultural products, including nearly 12 million metric tons of soybeans. In addition, China committed to cooperate more closely with the U.S. on cracking down on the production and export of fentanyl precursors, a move that has both economic and political significance given the opioid crisis in the United States. However, despite these commitments, analysts widely describe the agreement as a temporary ceasefire rather than a permanent solution. The deal lacks enforcement mechanisms, relies on vague implementation timelines, and leaves unresolved the core disputes over technology transfer, intellectual property rights, and state subsidies, issues that have defined the U.S.-China trade war since its inception. Many observers argue that the U.S. is using the tariff rollback as a tactical pause to regroup and strengthen its negotiating position rather than signaling a genuine shift toward détente. At the same time, Washington has pursued a broader reconfiguration of its global trade relationships beyond China, targeting multiple fronts simultaneously. One of the key successes has been a breakthrough deal with Japan that capped tariffs at 15% on major industrial goods, including automobiles and electronics, thereby averting the threat of new duties that were scheduled to take effect in August 2025. This U.S.-Japan agreement is widely regarded as a template for future trade arrangements, reflecting the administration's preference for bilateral pacts that prioritize reciprocity and tangible economic outcomes over large multilateral frameworks. However, while progress with Japan has been positive, negotiations with the European Union have proved far more contentious. The U.S. Commerce Secretary set an August 1st deadline for Brussels to finalize a new tariff framework, warning that failure to do so would trigger sweeping tariffs on European steel, autos, and agricultural exports. In response, the European Union temporarily suspended plans for retaliatory tariffs in April 2025, signaling a willingness to engage diplomatically, but also underscoring its frustration with Washington's hardline tactics. European leaders have criticized the U.S. approach as economic coercion, while the Trump administration insists it is merely restoring fairness to a system long skewed against American manufacturers. Adding further complexity, President Trump signed an executive order in July 2025 institutionalizing a policy of reciprocal tariffs, meaning that the U.S. would impose the same level of tariffs on a country that country imposes on American goods. The order marks a clear departure from traditional World Trade Organization norms and underscores the administration's belief that the global trade system must be reset to ensure symmetry. Supporters argue that this approach levels the playing field and forces other nations to reduce unfair barriers, while critics warn it could undermine the multilateral trading system and accelerate global economic fragmentation. The implications of these moves are profound, not only for America's major partners, but also for emerging economies that depend heavily on access to U.S. markets. In North America, the administration's decision to impose tariffs of up to 25% on selected Canadian and Mexican imports, citing concerns about border security, migration, and illicit drug flows, has strained the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, which had previously ensured tariff-free trade across the continent. Canada responded with its own 25% tariffs on U.S. products, while Mexico adopted a more cautious stance, opting for negotiations over retaliation. The episode illustrates how Washington is willing to revisit even long-standing trade pacts when broader political or security considerations are at stake. In practice, the United States strategy has produced a global environment characterized by both confrontation and conditional cooperation. Average applied tariffs remain significantly higher than pre-2020 levels, and the threat of additional duties continues to hang over many economies. Yet at the same time, the U.S. has demonstrated flexibility in rewarding countries that meet its demands with tariff relief or exemptions. The recent agreements with China and Japan are part of this pressure and reward approach. Nations that accommodate U.S. interests receive tariff reductions, while those that resist face escalating penalties. This method has created both uncertainty and opportunity in global markets. For businesses, particularly in manufacturing and agriculture, it has introduced new volatility in supply chains and pricing structures, as companies attempt to navigate a world where trade rules can shift overnight depending on political developments. Economists note that while short-term disruptions have increased, some U.S. industries, especially domestic manufacturing and energy, have benefited from the protective effects of tariffs and the resulting reshoring of production. However, many multinational corporations, including American ones, have voiced concern that the lack of predictability could dampen long-term investment and innovation. The European Union, meanwhile, faces a dilemma. It must decide whether to align more closely with U.S. demands or pursue an independent trade path that could risk U.S. retaliation. For China, the recent truce has provided temporary relief for its exporters amid a slowing domestic economy, but Beijing's leadership remains wary of U.S. unpredictability and continues to strengthen trade ties with Russia, the Middle East, and the Global South as a counterbalance. In essence, the U.S. has positioned itself as the central arbiter of global trade terms, leveraging its market size and geopolitical influence to extract concessions from both allies and rivals. Yet this assertive approach carries significant risks. It undermines the authority of the World Trade Organization, increases the likelihood of retaliatory blocs forming among U.S. trading partners, and raises the specter of a prolonged fragmentation of the global trading system into competing spheres of influence. The broader economic implications are equally complex. While U.S. GDP growth has remained stable, supported by strong domestic demand and industrial production, inflationary pressures persist due to higher import costs. In Asia and Europe, exporters face mounting challenges as tariffs disrupt established supply chains, forcing many companies to relocate production or seek new markets. For developing countries, including those in Africa and South Asia, the U.S. tariff policy creates both threats and openings. On one hand, heightened protectionism could reduce their export competitiveness. On the other, trade realignments may open new niches for goods once sourced from China or Europe. Many nations are adopting a wait-and-adapt strategy, closely monitoring how U.S. bilateral agreements evolve before committing to new trade alignments. Analysts also point out that the intertwining of trade and security issues, such as technology exports, energy resources, and strategic minerals, has blurred the line between economic and geopolitical policy. The U.S. restrictions on advanced chip exports to China and its efforts to secure supply chains for critical minerals through deals with allies like Australia and Canada exemplify how tariff negotiations now serve broader strategic purposes. Meanwhile, domestic political factors loom large. With the 2026 midterm elections approaching, the Trump administration has been eager to frame its trade policy as a victory for American workers and industries. using high-profile deals to bolster its narrative of economic nationalism. However, the political opposition argues that the tariff-heavy approach risks alienating key allies, raising consumer prices, and weakening the cooperative frameworks that underpinned decades of global economic growth. The tension between these perspectives defines the uncertain outlook of the world trading system. As 2025 draws to a close, the overarching picture is that of a world economy caught between two competing models, one based on open, rules-based trade, and another driven by national power and reciprocity. The latest U.S. tariff negotiations reveal that Washington is determined to assert control over the latter model, forcing other nations to adapt or risk exclusion. Whether this new paradigm will lead to a more balanced global system or a fragmented one remains to be seen. But what is clear is that the age of predictable low-tariff globalization has ended. The coming months will determine whether the fragile truce with China holds, whether Europe concedes to American terms, and whether emerging economies can navigate the shifting currents of trade realignment without being swept aside. For now, the United States stands at the center of a rapidly changing global trade order, wielding tariffs not just as economic tools, but as instruments of power, persuasion, and political strategy in an increasingly divided world.